Deep in the hills of rural West Virginia, something stirs in the dark. Not a ghost story passed down around a campfire, not a legend invented to scare children. This is a documented series of real reports filed by real people living miles apart from one another, people who had never met, never spoken, and yet described the exact same thing happening to them at the exact same moment. 3 a.m. Footsteps circling their homes, shadows drifting past windows, the sound of someone or something trying to open their doors. And then, at 3:07 a.m., without warning, without explanation, silence. Complete and total silence. As if nothing had ever been there at all. No footprints were ever found, no forced entry, no suspects, no official explanation. And to this day, in the hollows and hills of West Virginia, residents say it still happens. Every single night. Always at 3 a.m. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city, your country, your little corner of the world down in the comments below. Because tonight, wherever you are, I want you to check the time before you keep reading. And if it's anywhere close to 3 a.m., maybe leave the lights on. We'll wait. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And tonight, knowing you're out there with me makes the story feel a little less lonely in the dark. There is a specific kind of silence that exists only in rural America after midnight. It is not the silence of a quiet room or the muffled hush of a city after the bars close. It is something older and heavier than that. It is the silence of hills that have been standing for millions of years, of forests so dense that sound itself seems to get lost inside them. It is the silence of places that existed long before human beings arrived and built their homes and told themselves they were safe. West Virginia is full of this kind of silence. The state sits deep in the Appalachian mountains, a place of extraordinary natural beauty and extraordinary isolation. Entire communities exist there that are separated from the nearest town by winding mountain roads that take 40 minutes to drive and look in the dark, like they lead nowhere at all. Families live in hollows, locals call them hollers, where the hills rise up so steeply on either side that the sky above you at night looks like a narrow ribbon of stars. These are tight-knit communities. People know their neighbors. They know the sounds of the land. They know what belongs and what does not. Which is why, when the incidents began, the people who experienced them knew immediately that something was wrong. Nobody can say with absolute certainty when the first report was filed. The earliest accounts that have been documented come from residents scattered across a rural region of the state. Not a single town, not a single neighborhood, but a wide stretch of countryside where homes sit separated by miles of forest and farmland. These were people who did not know each other, people who had no reason to coordinate their stories, people who, in many cases, didn't even know the others existed until local authorities began piecing the reports together and realized, with growing unease, that every single account was describing the same thing. It began at 3 a.m., it ended at 3:07 a.m., and in between those 7 minutes, something was outside their homes. The first account that most researchers point to as the foundation of what would become known as the West Virginia 3 a.m. incident comes from a woman referred to in most documentation only by her initials, M.H., who lived alone in a small house at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by woodland on 3 sides. She described waking suddenly, without any clear reason, at precisely 3 a.m. She was certain of the time because she had a digital clock on her bedside table, and she looked at it the moment her eyes opened. The number 300 was glowing in red. She lay still for a moment, trying to understand what had woken her. The house was quiet, the night outside was quiet, and then she heard it. Footsteps. Not inside the house, outside it. On the gravel that ran along the side of her home, just beneath her bedroom window. Slow, deliberate footsteps. The sound of someone walking unhurried, as if they were simply taking a late-night stroll along the side of her house. M.H. described her first instinct as confusion rather than fear. She assumed it was an animal, a deer, perhaps, or a dog, and she told herself to go back to sleep. But the footsteps did not sound like an animal. They were too evenly spaced, too deliberate, too human. She sat up in bed. She did not turn on the light. She moved to the window and, keeping herself pressed against the wall, she angled her face to look out into the darkness. She saw a shadow. Not a person, exactly, not a clear shape, but a darkness moving against the darkness outside, passing slowly in front of the pale rectangle of her window, moving from left to right along the wall of her house. And then it was gone. She stood at the window for what felt like a very long time. The footsteps had stopped. The night was quiet again. She checked her clock. 3:07 a.m. She filed a report with local authorities the following morning. Deputies came out and walked the perimeter of her property. They found nothing. No footprints in the gravel. No disturbance in the soil near the tree line. No evidence that anyone had been there at all. The deputies were polite. They took her report seriously. But privately, the general assumption was that MH had experienced a vivid dream, or perhaps a bout of sleep paralysis, that half-waking state in which the mind generates sensations of presence and danger while the body remains unable to move. It is a well-documented phenomenon. It would be, in many ways, a satisfying explanation, except that MH had not been unable to move. She had walked across her room, she had looked out the window, she had seen something, and she was not the only one. Within the following weeks and months, additional reports began to come in from residents across the same rural region. Each report was filed independently. Each described variations of the same core experience. A man living several miles from MH, referred to as RT, reported waking at 3 a.m. to the sound of slow knocking. Not a frantic pounding, not an urgent rapping. Just a quiet, rhythmic knock moving along the outer wall of his house as if someone was walking with their knuckles trailing against the siding. He described it as patient. As if whatever was outside was not trying to get in. As if it simply wanted him to know it was there. He turned on every light in the house. He looked out every window. He saw nothing. He opened his front door, a decision he immediately regretted, he later said, though he could not have explained why, and found his porch empty, his yard empty, the road beyond his property dark and still. He stood there in the cold for a moment, and then he heard the knocking stop. He checked his phone. 3:07 a.m. A family living in a different part of the region, a husband, a wife, and their teenage daughter all woke simultaneously at 3 a.m. to the sound of someone walking on their porch. The porch ran the full length of the front of their home, and the footsteps moved across it slowly from one end to the other. The husband got out of bed and looked out the front window. He described seeing a shape, dark, humanoid in silhouette, standing at the far end of the porch, facing the house. He blinked. The shape was gone. And the footsteps had stopped. His wife and daughter, in their separate rooms, had each heard the exact same thing and had each gotten up to look out their respective windows. None of them had seen anyone approach. None of them had seen anyone leave. The porch showed no signs of disturbance. The motion-sensitive light that should have activated had not turned on. 3:07 a.m. As the reports accumulated, local authorities began to quietly discuss the possibility of a coordinated pattern. Not because they believed in anything supernatural. Law enforcement, as a professional discipline, operates on the assumption that there is always a human explanation, but because the consistency of the reports was statistically unusual. Different homes, different people, no shared social connections, miles of separation between them. And yet, 3 a.m., 7 minutes, activity outside the home, nothing found afterward. One theory proposed early on was the possibility of a single individual or group moving through the region, deliberately visiting homes during the early morning hours, perhaps as a form of harassment, perhaps as some kind of organized intimidation. Perhaps, and this was a theory that some residents found credible as some kind of test, an attempt to see how rural residents would respond to nighttime intrusion. Investigators explored this theory thoroughly. They mapped the locations of every reported incident and analyzed the distances between them. In several cases, the homes reporting incidents were so far apart, along roads so winding and slow, that it would have been physically impossible for a single person to have visited all of them in the same 7-minute window, not without a vehicle moving at speeds that would have been audible for miles on quiet rural roads, and no one reported hearing a vehicle. The group of individuals theory was harder to rule out entirely, but it raised its own questions. How would a group organize simultaneous visits to homes separated by miles of rural terrain? How would they arrive and depart without leaving a single footprint, without triggering any motion sensors, without being seen on any of the dashcam footage or security cameras that some residents had installed specifically because of the reports? And most puzzling of all, how would they know each time to stop at exactly 3:07 a.m.? No theory has ever fully answered these questions. Over time, researchers and investigators who took an interest in the case began to look for environmental explanations, natural phenomena that might account for what residents were experiencing. The Appalachian region has a long history of geological and acoustic peculiarities. The mountains and valleys create complex sound corridors where noise from one location can travel unexpected distances and arrive at another location in distorted form. A vehicle idling on a highway miles away might, under the right atmospheric conditions, be heard as footsteps on gravel. A shift in temperature between the warm interior of a house and the cold night air outside can cause wood and metal to expand and contract, producing sounds uncannily similar to knocking. These are real phenomena. They are documented. They explain many reported hauntings and unexplained incidents every year, but they have difficulty accounting for the visual component of the West Virginia reports: the shadows, the shapes, the silhouettes. Sound can travel and distort in remarkable ways. Shadow cannot. One atmospheric researcher who studied the reports noted that the Appalachian Mountains create specific low cloud formations on certain nights that can, when lit by distant ambient light, a farmhouse, a passing car, the moon, cast moving shadows against the sides of buildings in ways that might appear to be human shapes. This is a known optical phenomenon. It is worth considering. And yet, the timing. Always 3 a.m. Always 3:07 a.m. Atmospheric conditions do not set themselves to a clock. Some investigators turned to a different kind of research. They began looking at what 3 a.m. means, not scientifically, but culturally, historically, psychologically. 3 a.m. is what sleep researchers call the nadir of the human circadian rhythm. It is the point in the 24-hour cycle when the human body's core temperature is at its lowest, when the sleep drive is at its strongest, and when, for those who do wake, the cognitive distinction between waking and dreaming is at its most fragile. People who wake at 3 a.m. are more likely to experience hypnagogic hallucinations, the vivid, sometimes alarming sensory experiences that accompany the edge between sleep and consciousness. They are more likely to experience heightened anxiety. They are more likely to misinterpret neutral sensory information, a branch scraping a roof, a raccoon moving through undergrowth, as threatening. This is a real and well-studied phenomenon. And it would, if applied to the West Virginia reports, suggest that what residents were experiencing was not external reality at all, but their own minds. Briefly untethered from reason by the peculiar chemistry of deep night. It would explain the fear, the vividness, the certainty. It might even explain the timing. If the human body tends to enter its deepest sleep trough around 3 a.m., it might also tend to surface briefly from that trough around 3:07, returning to fuller consciousness and leaving behind it the fading impression of whatever the dreaming mind had generated. 7 minutes. Could the human mind be that precise? Sleep researchers are divided on the question. The consensus is that while the body is rhythmic, it is not typically clock precise in this way. The kind of uniform timing reported across the West Virginia incidents, not approximately 3 a.m., not somewhere between 2 and 4, but exactly 3:00 and exactly 3:07, falls outside what most sleep scientists would consider a plausible range for naturally occurring sleep disturbance. But science rarely says impossible. It says unlikely. There is another dimension to the West Virginia 3 a.m. incident that has received less attention in the broader conversation about it, but that may, in some ways, be the most important dimension of all: the land. West Virginia's rural regions sit on top of a complex geological substrate. Coal mines, both active and abandoned, run beneath large portions of the state. These mines create underground voids and passages that are in many cases structurally unstable. They shift, they settle. They emit gases, primarily methane and carbon monoxide, that percolate up through the soil and can, under certain conditions, enter the lower floors of buildings situated above them. Carbon monoxide poisoning, even at sublethal levels, is known to cause a specific cluster of symptoms: sudden waking during the night, a sense of presence or being watched, auditory hallucinations, visual disturbances, profound anxiety, and confusion. These symptoms are sometimes referred to, in the medical literature, as haunting syndrome, a grim and somewhat darkly humorous name for the phenomenon that has, over the decades, explained a number of famous alleged hauntings. Investigators looked into this possibility for the West Virginia reports. Carbon monoxide detectors were installed in several of the affected homes. Geological surveys were conducted in parts of the region. The results were inconclusive. Some homes showed slightly elevated levels of naturally occurring gases at certain times of year. Others showed nothing unusual at all. The distribution did not clearly correlate with which homes reported incidents. And carbon monoxide poisoning, while it can produce hallucinations of presence, does not typically produce externally visible shadows or sounds loud enough to wake multiple people in different parts of the same house simultaneously. More significantly, it does not produce sounds that can be heard from outside the home. And some residents who lived in the affected areas, people who had never experienced an incident themselves, reported, on separate occasions, hearing sounds outside neighboring homes at 3 a.m. Sounds consistent with what the residents of those homes had reported. The sounds were not coming from inside their own heads. Someone, or something, was out there. The incidents continued. There was no escalation, no incident ever became violent, no property was ever damaged, no resident was ever physically harmed. Whatever was happening outside these homes during those 7 minutes existed entirely in the space between contact and consequence. It came, it made itself known, and it left. This is, in itself, one of the strangest aspects of the case. Human intruders have motivation, robbery, intimidation, surveillance. Animals have motivation, food, territory, shelter. Whatever was visiting these homes appeared to have no motivation beyond presence. It circled, it knocked, it passed by windows. And at 3:07 a.m., it was gone. Some residents began to develop rituals around the time they would leave a light on. They would sit in their kitchens with a cup of coffee between 2:59 and 3:08, waiting for it to pass. Some reported that this made no difference. The sounds continued whether they were awake or asleep, whether lights were on or off. Others reported that on nights when they stayed awake and watched, nothing happened. As if whatever was out there knew when it was being observed and chose, on those nights, not to appear, or chose to be still. One elderly resident, a man who had lived in the region his entire life, who had heard the stories of the incidents but never experienced one himself, offered what he considered to be a straightforward explanation. He said that the hills of West Virginia had always had things in them that did not belong to the modern world. Not demons, he was careful to say, not ghosts exactly, just presences. Things that had been in the hills long before the first settlers arrived, long before the coal companies came, long before the roads were cut and the power lines were strung. Things that had their own rhythms, their own patterns, their own reasons for doing what they did. And he said that the smart approach was not to try to understand them, but simply to let them go about their business and trust that they would, at 3:07, be done. He said this without fear, with a kind of matter-of-fact acceptance that was somehow more unsettling than fear would have been. No official investigation was ever formally closed, because no official investigation was ever formally opened. The reports exist in county records, they were taken seriously enough to file, seriously enough to prompt site visits, but they never accumulated sufficient evidence to constitute a criminal case, and they never attracted sufficient media attention to prompt a larger inquiry. The region remains quiet, in the way that rural West Virginia always is, and residents continue to report the incidents. Not everyone. Not every night, not in any predictable pattern of location or frequency, but with enough regularity that the phenomenon has become, in certain communities, simply a part of life. People know about the 3 a.m. incidents, the way they know about black ice on the mountain roads in winter, or the way the creek rises after heavy rain. It is something that happens here. Something that has always happened here, or at least has been happening long enough that no one can remember a time before it. They do not have an explanation. Neither do the investigators, neither does science, at least not with the precision and consistency that the case seems to demand. What we are left with is this: a region, a time, 7 minutes, and a question that remains, as of this moment, unanswered. What comes to the hills of West Virginia at 3 in the morning, and why always does it leave at 3:07? The 7-minute detail is the one that stays with people the longest once they hear the story, because 7 minutes is such a specific amount of time. It is not a round number. It is not an hour or a half hour or even 10 minutes. 7 minutes is the length of a short conversation, a slow walk around a city block, a piece of music. It is enough time to do something, to accomplish something, and yet no one has ever been able to determine what, if anything, is being accomplished. Some researchers have noted that 7 minutes falls precisely within the range of what sleep scientists call a sleep spindle, a brief oscillation of neural activity during non-REM sleep that can, in some individuals, produce sensations of sound and movement. If an entire community were experiencing synchronized sleep spindles, they might report simultaneous disturbances. But sleep spindles do not synchronize between unconnected individuals miles apart. The human brain does not work that way. Others have pointed to the significance of the number 7 in various cultural and spiritual traditions. 7 as a number of completion, of cyclical return, of thresholds crossed and recrossed. This is interesting and perhaps meaningful in the context of how the affected communities have come to interpret the incidents. But numerological significance does not explain physical footsteps on gravel. The truth, if there is a truth, is somewhere in the space between all of these explanations. Or perhaps it is in a space that none of these explanations have yet reached. If you are reading this late at night and somehow the nature of the story suggests that many of you are, you may find yourself doing something that readers of this kind of story often do. You may find yourself looking at the clock. If it is anywhere near 3 a.m. where you are right now, I want you to notice something. Notice how quiet it has become. Notice the particular quality of the silence outside your window. Notice whether the silence sounds entirely empty or whether, beneath it, there is something that might possibly be, the faintest suggestion of movement. And then I want you to remember that whatever you hear, or think you hear, or almost hear, it will be over at 3:07. It always ends at 3:07. That is the one thing in this entire strange and unsettling story that has remained absolutely constant. Whatever comes, and something does come, or something that functions like coming, something that produces the impression and the evidence of presence, it does not stay. It does not linger past its appointed moment. It has, in its own way, a kind of discipline, a kind of predictability, which is, depending on how you think about it, either the most comforting or the most terrifying aspect of the whole affair. Comforting because it ends, terrifying because it knows when to end. To the residents of that rural West Virginia region who have lived with this for years, who have built their nightly routines around a 7-minute window, who have learned to sleep through the sounds or to wait them out over cups of coffee at their kitchen tables, there is a kind of quiet resilience that is itself remarkable. They have not fled. They have not, for the most part, demanded answers with any urgency. They have simply continued to live in the hills that their families have lived in for generations, alongside whatever else lives in those hills. In the old Appalachian tradition of making peace with the things you cannot change and cannot understand, there is something deeply human in that, and something deeply admirable. The hills of West Virginia are very old. The things in them, whatever they are, may be older still. And every morning, when the sun comes up over the ridgeline and the birds begin, and the world fills once more with the sounds of daylight and ordinary life, the residents of that region make their coffee and start their days. And they do not talk about what happened at 3 a.m., because by 3:07, it was already over. And tomorrow night, they will sleep, as they always do, knowing that whatever comes will come, and knowing that it will, as it always has, be gone before the dark begins to soften toward dawn. Sleep well tonight. Wherever you are, the hills are quiet now, and 3 a.m., if it hasn't come yet, is still a few hours away. Rest easy. You've got time. On a cold February night in 1978, 5 men drove into the mountains to watch a basketball game. They never made it home. What happened next would become one of America's most baffling mysteries. Bodies found months later. A trailer stocked with food where a man starved to death. Footprints leading nowhere. Missing persons. Unexplained decisions. This is the story of the Yuba County Five, a case so strange that even seasoned investigators called it America's Dyatlov Pass incident. What really happened in those dark, frozen mountains? The answer might be more disturbing than you think. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. The evening of February 24th, 1978, started like any other for 5 friends from Yuba County, California. Gary Mathias, age 32. Jack Madruga, age 30. Bill Sterling, age 29. Jack Hewitt, age 24. And Ted Waher, age 32. These 5 men, all with mild intellectual disabilities except Mathias, who had been discharged from the army with schizophrenia, shared a special bond. They were more than friends. They were a team. They called themselves the Gateway Gators, a Special Olympics basketball team that gave them purpose, community, and pride. That Friday night, they had a mission. They were driving from Yuba City to Chico, California, a distance of about 50 miles, to watch a college basketball game at California State University, Chico. But this wasn't just any game. The next day, Saturday, February 25th, they had their own big game, a Special Olympics basketball tournament that they'd been training for all season. Their trip to Chico was meant to be quick. Watch the game, grab some food, and head home to get a good night's rest before their big day. Their families expected them home by 11 p.m. The 5 men piled into Jack Madruga's turquoise and white Montego Mercury. Jack was known to be an exceptionally careful driver, almost obsessively so. He took meticulous care of his car and followed traffic rules to the letter. The group made it to the game without incident. Witnesses later confirmed seeing them at the game, which ended around 10 p.m. They seemed in good spirits, excited, normal. After the game ended, they bought some snacks at a local market. Everything seemed perfectly routine. But then, something went terribly wrong. The 5 men never made it home that night. When they didn't show up for their basketball game on Saturday morning, their families immediately knew something was wrong. These men were reliable, especially when it came to basketball. They lived for these games. They wouldn't miss it unless something serious had happened. By Saturday afternoon, frantic family members had filed missing persons reports. The police began their investigation, but in those early hours, there were no leads, no clues, nothing. 5 men had simply vanished into the night. The first break in the case came days later, but it only deepened the mystery. On February 28th, 4 days after the men disappeared, a Forest Service worker in the Plumas National Forest made a shocking discovery. There, on a mountain road near Rogers Cow Camp, about 70 miles from Chico and in the complete opposite direction from Yuba City, sat Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego. The car was found on a remote, snow-covered mountain road at an elevation of about 4,400 feet. It had been driven up a steep, narrow logging road that was barely passable, especially in winter conditions. When investigators examined the vehicle, what they found made no sense. The car was in relatively good condition. It hadn't crashed. It wasn't damaged. The keys were missing, but the car could still be started with a simple bypass. The gas tank had about a quarter tank of fuel remaining. Here's where it gets strange. The car had been driven far up this treacherous mountain road. well beyond where it should have been able to go. The undercarriage showed damage from high centering on the snow. Someone had essentially forced this car up an impossible route. The windows were down, the heater was off, even though it was freezing outside. Personal items belonging to the men were still inside. Maps, medications, a book about the 1960 NFL championship, but no sign of the 5 men. The police immediately launched a search and rescue operation. Dozens of search teams, including volunteers, law enforcement, and Forest Service personnel, combed the surrounding wilderness. They used search dogs, helicopters, and ground teams. The area where the car was found is rugged, heavily forested, and in February, it's buried under several feet of snow with temperatures regularly dropping below freezing at night. Despite extensive searching, they found nothing. No bodies, no tracks, no evidence of where the men had gone. It was as if they had walked into the snow and simply ceased to exist. For months, the families waited in agony. Then, on June 4th, 1978, nearly 4 months after the men disappeared, a Forest Service crew making their seasonal rounds came across a horrifying scene. About 19.5 miles from where the car was found, they discovered a small remote Forest Service trailer at a location called Rogers Cow Camp. Inside the trailer, they found the body of Ted Weiher. What they discovered would haunt investigators for decades. Ted Weiher had died, but not quickly. The condition of his body and the scene inside the trailer told a story of prolonged suffering. He had lost between 80 and 100 pounds. His feet were badly frostbitten. He had apparently been lying on a makeshift bed for weeks, slowly wasting away. But here's what made investigators' blood run cold. The trailer was stocked with supplies. There was a large supply of canned and dried food, enough to sustain someone for months. There was a propane tank with fuel, yet the propane heater had not been used. There were matches in the trailer. There were can openers. There were blankets. Ted Weiher had starved to death and died of hypothermia in a shelter filled with food and heating supplies. His body showed signs that he had eaten some food. Candy wrappers and opened cans were found near him, but for some inexplicable reason, he hadn't used the heater. He hadn't eaten most of the available food. He had slowly died in a place where he could have survived for months. Medical examiners estimated he had lived for at least 8 to 13 weeks in that trailer before dying. Let that sink in. For 2 to 3 months, Ted Weiher lay in that trailer, surrounded by the means of survival, but somehow unable or unwilling to use them to save himself. The discovery of Ted's body led to renewed search efforts in the immediate area. About a mile away from the trailer, searchers found the skeletal remains of 3 more of the men. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found together. Their remains showed they had died months earlier, likely within days or weeks of the initial disappearance. Cause of death appeared to be exposure to the elements. Jack Hewitt's remains were found separately, also showing he had died from exposure. Their bodies were found in a heavily forested area, still partially covered by snow that had finally melted with the arrival of summer. That left Gary Mathias. To this day, Gary Mathias has never been found. Not his body, not any trace of him. He simply vanished into those mountains, and despite extensive searches over the years, he remains missing. Gary was different from the others in one crucial way. While the other 4 men had mild intellectual disabilities and generally needed some level of supervision in their daily lives, Gary had been a decorated Army veteran who served in Germany. His discharge was due to schizophrenia, a condition that required medication that he had stopped taking. Investigators found his medication in the abandoned car. He had been off his meds for at least 24 hours when the group disappeared. The investigation that followed tried desperately to piece together what had happened. The timeline seemed simple at first. The men left the basketball game around 10 p.m. They should have driven south on Highway 99 back to Yuba City. Instead, somehow, they ended up 70 miles away, driving up a remote mountain road in the Plumas National Forest in the complete opposite direction. The road where their car was found, the Oroville-Quincy Highway, was not a road you ended up on by accident. You had to make deliberate turns to get there. It wasn't a shortcut. It wasn't on the way to anything. It led into wilderness. Investigators interviewed dozens of witnesses. One particularly intriguing account came from Joseph Shawns, a man who had been in the area that same night. Shawns told police that he had gone up into the mountains that evening to check on a work site. His truck had become stuck in the snow, and he'd spent hours trying to free it. Around 5:30 or 6 a.m. on the morning of February 25th, as he was sitting in his truck with his family, Sean's claimed he saw a group of men and a woman walking near his vehicle. He called out for help, but they ignored him. He later saw flashlights in the forest and heard voices, but no one came to help him despite his calls. He eventually freed his truck and drove down the mountain. At first, investigators were skeptical of Sean's story. But when they examined the timeline and location, it seemed to match up. If Sean saw the Yuba County 5 around 5:30 or 6 a.m., that meant the men had been wandering in the freezing mountains for at least 7 hours after leaving the basketball game. But why? Why would they drive up that mountain road? Why would they abandon a working car? Why would they walk deeper into the wilderness instead of back towards civilization? And who was the woman Sean's claimed to see? Several theories emerged over the years. The first and most disturbing was foul play. Perhaps the men had encountered someone dangerous, someone who had forced them up that mountain road at gunpoint, someone who had terrorized them, causing them to flee into the snow. This would explain the seemingly irrational decisions. It would explain why they kept going deeper into the forest instead of seeking help. But there was no evidence of another person. No additional footprints in the areas that were searched. No signs of a struggle. No witnesses who saw the men with anyone else after they left the basketball game. The second theory focused on Gary Mathias and his mental health condition. Gary was off his medication for his schizophrenia. When someone with schizophrenia stops taking their medication, they can experience paranoid delusions, hallucinations, and extremely irrational behavior. Some investigators theorized that Gary may have had a psychotic episode that night. Perhaps he became paranoid and convinced the others they were in danger. Perhaps he insisted they drive up the mountain to escape some imagined threat that only he could perceive. The others, who trusted Gary and looked up to him as the most experienced and worldly member of the group due to his military service, may have followed his lead without question. This could explain why Jack Madruga, normally such a careful and meticulous driver who treated his car like a prized possession, would drive his vehicle up an impassable road, damaging the undercarriage and pushing the car far beyond its limits. They were following Gary's increasingly frantic and confused instructions. In his psychotic state, Gary might have believed they were being chased, or that going up the mountain was their only means of escape from some perceived danger. But this theory, while compelling, still had significant problems. Even if Gary was experiencing severe delusions and paranoia, why would the other 4 men continue to follow him for hours as they walked through freezing temperatures? Why would they walk 19 miles through deep snow in the darkness? At what point would the physical reality of the cold, the exhaustion, and the obvious danger have broken through whatever hold Gary's words had on them? These were grown men, not children. And it still didn't explain the most baffling aspect of the case, Ted Wyer's death in that trailer. Even if Gary had led them there in a state of psychosis, why would Ted not use the heater once they arrived? Why would he not eat the abundant food? What was preventing him from taking these basic survival actions? A third theory suggested that the men simply got lost due to a navigation error. Perhaps they missed a turn in the dark. Perhaps they thought they were taking a shortcut back to Yuba City, but ended up on the wrong road. When they realized their mistake, they were already far up the mountain. When the car finally got stuck in the snow and couldn't go any further, they made the fatal decision to abandon it and walk for help. But in the darkness and unfamiliar terrain, they walked in the wrong direction, going deeper into the wilderness instead of back toward the highway and civilization. As they walked, the freezing temperatures began to take their toll. Hypothermia is insidious. It doesn't just make you cold. It affects your brain function, your decision-making abilities, your judgment. People with severe hypothermia have been known to do bizarre things. There's even a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, where hypothermia victims remove their clothing because their confused brains misinterpret signals from the body. As the 5 men got colder and more exhausted, their mental faculties would have deteriorated. They may have been walking in circles without realizing it. When some of them started to collapse, the others may have kept going, perhaps not fully understanding that their friends were dying behind them. But even this seemingly more rational explanation falls apart when you examine it closely. First, these men were not incompetent or helpless. Yes, 4 of them had mild intellectual disabilities, but they were functional, independent adults who held jobs, lived semi-independently, and participated in organized competitive sports. They knew how to ask for help. They understood basic concepts of safety and danger. They knew what cold felt like and that it could kill them. They knew their important basketball game was the next day, something they had been training for and were excited about. The idea that all 5 of them would simultaneously become so confused and disoriented that they would walk 19 miles in the wrong direction, deeper and deeper into a frozen wilderness, strains credibility. And once again, this theory completely fails to explain Ted's behavior in the trailer. The condition of Ted Wire's body and the scene inside that trailer presented perhaps the single most disturbing and inexplicable mystery of the entire case. Medical examiners who studied his remains were genuinely baffled. Ted had been a large man, well over 200 pounds when he disappeared. When his body was discovered, he weighed approximately 80 to 90 pounds. The extreme weight loss suggested months of near-total starvation. The progression of his decline could be traced through the physical evidence. His body showed the classic signs of long-term malnutrition and starvation. His feet were severely frostbitten, with tissue damage consistent with prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures without adequate protection. But here's what made investigators' blood run cold and kept them awake at night. The trailer where Ted died was well stocked with supplies. There wasn't just a little food. There was a substantial cache of sea rations, military-style canned goods, and other non-perishable foods. Enough to sustain a person for many months. There was a functional propane heating system with adequate fuel in the tank. There were matches to light the heater. There were can openers to access the food. There were blankets and other materials that could provide warmth. In other words, Ted Wire died of starvation and hypothermia while literally surrounded by everything he needed to survive. The evidence showed that Ted had eaten some food during his time in the trailer. Candy wrappers were found near his makeshift bed. Several cans had been opened and their contents consumed. So he knew the food was there. He was capable of accessing at least some of it, but for reasons that no one has ever been able to adequately explain, he didn't use the heater to warm himself. He didn't eat most of the available food, despite slowly starving to death. He simply lay on that bed, day after day, week after week, gradually wasting away in a place where he had the means to survive indefinitely. Medical examiners estimated, based on the condition of his body and the rate of decomposition and weight loss, that Ted had lived in that trailer for at least 8 to 13 weeks before finally succumbing. That's 2 to 3 months. Let that truly sink in for a moment. For somewhere between 2 and 3 months, Ted Wire lay in that small Forest Service trailer. He was alone, cold, hungry, and slowly dying. The heater was right there. The food was right there. Warmth and sustenance were within arm's reach, but something prevented him from using them effectively. What could cause a human being, even one with intellectual disabilities, to behave this way? What could override the most basic survival instincts? Some investigators and psychologists who studied the case theorized that Ted's frostbitten feet may have severely limited his mobility within the trailer. Perhaps the pain and damage to his feet prevented him from moving around effectively. Perhaps he couldn't reach the main food storage area. Perhaps he couldn't operate the heater's controls with his damaged frostbitten hands. But even this explanation feels inadequate when you really think about it. The trailer was small, just a few dozen square feet. Even if Ted was immobilized and in pain, he could have crawled. He could have dragged himself across that short distance. The level of food deprivation he experienced, the months of starvation, suggests something far beyond a simple inability to physically reach supplies. It suggests that he wasn't trying to reach them, or that his mind had deteriorated to a point where he could no longer connect the need for food with the action of obtaining and eating it. The discovery of Ted's body led to intensified search efforts in the immediate vicinity of the trailer. Approximately 1 mile away through the forest, searchers made another grim discovery. They found the skeletal remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling lying close together. The condition of their remains and the lack of soft tissue suggested they had died much earlier than Ted, probably within the first few days or weeks after the group's disappearance. The cause of death was determined to be exposure to the elements. They had essentially frozen to death in the forest. Not far from them, searchers found the remains of Jack Hewitt. His remains told the same story: death by exposure to the brutal mountain cold. The fact that these three men were found relatively close to the trailer raised yet more questions. Had they been trying to reach the trailer and fallen short? Had they been with Ted initially and then left, or been left behind? Did Ted make it to the trailer alone, or had others been with him? If Gary Mathias had been there, had he left to seek help? The lack of any written message or note from Ted in the trailer, despite the presence of paper and writing implements among the supplies, meant there was no first-hand account of what had happened during those final weeks. And then there was Gary Mathias, the fifth member of the group and the only one who has never been found. Not his body, not his remains, not a single trace of him has ever been discovered despite extensive searches that have continued sporadically over the decades. Gary simply vanished into those mountains as completely as if he had never existed. His disappearance is particularly significant because of who he was and his background. Unlike the other four men, Gary didn't have an intellectual disability. He was, by all accounts, intelligent and capable. His time in the army, including his service in Germany, meant he had more life experience and exposure to the world than his four friends. He had survival training. He understood organization and planning. But Gary also had schizophrenia, a serious mental illness that required daily medication to manage. The medication found in the abandoned car told investigators that Gary had been off his meds for at least 24 hours, possibly longer. For someone with schizophrenia, missing even a few doses of medication can trigger a relapse into psychosis. Symptoms can include paranoid delusions, where the person believes others are out to get them or that they're in danger, hallucinations, both auditory and visual, severely disorganized thinking that makes it difficult to communicate coherently or make rational decisions, command hallucinations that tell the person to do specific things. In short, Gary's untreated schizophrenia could have caused him to perceive reality in a fundamentally different and frightening way than his companions. Many investigators and analysts who have studied the case believe that Gary Mathias is the key to understanding what happened. The theory goes something like this. As the five men were driving home from the basketball game, Gary began to experience symptoms of psychosis brought on by being off his medication. He started to become paranoid. Perhaps he thought they were being followed. Perhaps he believed there was danger back in Yuba City and they needed to take a different route. Gary's military background and the respect the other men had for him meant that when he started giving urgent, insistent directions to take different roads, Jack Madruga complied without argument. As Gary's psychotic episode intensified, his directions became more frantic and less rational. He kept insisting they needed to go further, to get away, to escape some threat that existed only in his deteriorating mind. The other men, increasingly confused and frightened but still trusting Gary, followed his lead. By the time they realized they were hopelessly lost on a mountain road in the middle of nowhere, it was too late. The car was stuck. Gary, deep in psychosis, may have insisted they couldn't stay with the car. Perhaps he believed their pursuers would find them there. He convinced the others they needed to walk, to keep moving. And so, they walked. Through the darkness, through the snow, through the freezing night. Gary leading the way, the others following, all of them growing colder and more exhausted with each step. As hypothermia began to set in, it would have affected the other four men more quickly than Gary, potentially. Their intellectual disabilities and lack of experience might have made them less able to recognize the danger or to resist Gary's increasingly confused commands. One by one, three of them, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jack Hewitt, reached the point where their bodies simply couldn't continue. They collapsed in the snow. They didn't get up again. That left Gary and Ted. Perhaps Ted was the strongest physically, or perhaps it was just chance that he was able to keep walking longer than the others. Somehow, through what must be considered either incredible luck or some vestige of Gary's military land navigation training surfacing through his psychosis, they found the Forest Service trailer. It wasn't visible from any road or trail. It was tucked away in a remote, heavily forested area. Finding it in the darkness, in the snow, while lost and disoriented, should have been impossible. But they found it. What happened after they reached the trailer is perhaps the most speculative part of this theory, but bear with the logic. Gary, even in his psychotic state, or perhaps because of it, may not have felt safe staying in the trailer. His paranoid delusions might have made him believe that staying in one place was dangerous, that they would be found by whatever imagined threats were chasing them. Or perhaps, in a moment of clarity, he realized the magnitude of the disaster and decided he needed to go for help. He left Ted in the trailer with the supplies and set out, either to escape his delusions or to find rescue. He never made it. His body is somewhere in those vast mountains, in a location where it has never been found despite years of searching. Ted remained in the trailer, but by this point, he was already severely hypothermic and likely in shock from everything that had happened. Hypothermia doesn't just make you cold, it profoundly affects brain function. Judgment becomes impaired. Simple tasks become impossible. The ability to plan and execute even basic actions deteriorates. Ted, with his existing intellectual disability now compounded by severe hypothermia, frostbitten extremities, and possibly injuries from the long walk, may simply have lacked the mental capacity to use the resources around him effectively. He ate a little food, enough to find and open, but couldn't organize the sustained effort needed to properly feed himself. The heater, which might have required understanding a sequence of steps to ignite and operate, was beyond his diminished capabilities. He wrapped himself in what he could find and lay down, and over the weeks that followed, he slowly faded away. This theory, as comprehensive as it tries to be, still leaves enormous questions unanswered. If Gary left the trailer, why is there no trace of him? The searches were extensive and covered a wide area. If Ted was in the trailer for weeks, why didn't he call out when search helicopters flew over the area in the initial days after the disappearance? Why was there no evidence that he tried to signal for help? Why didn't he write any kind of message, even a simple one? And perhaps most frustratingly, we'll never know for certain what Gary was thinking or experiencing. Was he in the grip of psychosis? Was he trying to save his friends or leading them to their doom? Did he realize what was happening, or was he lost in a world of delusions and hallucinations? The investigation into the Yuba County 5 case was extensive and thorough for its time. Law enforcement officers interviewed hundreds of people. Every friend, family member, acquaintance, and coworker of the 5 men was questioned. Investigators looked for any possible motive, any enemy, any reason someone might want to harm these 5 harmless men. They came up empty. Everyone described the Yuba County 5 as gentle, friendly, kind individuals. They weren't involved in anything dangerous or illegal. They didn't have conflicts with anyone. They weren't in debt. They didn't have secret lives. They were just 5 friends who loved basketball and each other's company. The families of the men reported something odd that had happened in the weeks before the disappearance. Several of them had received strange phone calls. The caller would say nothing, just breathe on the line, and then hang up. At the time, the families had dismissed these calls as pranks, the kind of thing that happened occasionally to everyone. But after the men disappeared, these silent phone calls took on a more sinister quality in everyone's minds. Had someone been watching the men? Stalking them? Planning something? Investigators followed up on these reports, but silent phone calls in 1978 were essentially untraceable unless they were frequent enough to set up monitoring equipment. No such monitoring had been established, so the calls remained just another mysterious element in a case full of mysteries. Decades have passed since that February night. It's been more than 45 years since 5 friends went to a basketball game and never came home. The case officially remains unsolved and open, though realistically, there's little chance of new evidence emerging after so much time. Gary Mathias is still listed as a missing person, though everyone understands that the chances of him being alive are essentially zero. The families of the 5 men have had to find ways to live with an incomprehensible tragedy that offers no clear answers, no closure, no justice, because there's no one to hold accountable. Most of the parents of the Yuba County 5 have passed away in the years since, taking with them the unbearable pain of losing a child in such a mysterious and horrific way. The surviving family members, the siblings, and other relatives still hold out a small, probably irrational hope that someday, somehow, there will be answers. Perhaps a hiker will stumble across Gary Mathias's remains in some remote ravine, and something on his body will provide a clue. Perhaps someone with knowledge of what happened, if there is such a person, will make a deathbed confession. Perhaps some piece of evidence will surface that finally makes the puzzle pieces fit together. But with each passing year, the likelihood of resolution diminishes further towards zero. The case has inspired numerous theories over the years, ranging from the plausible to the outlandish. Some people in the true crime community believe the men encountered something supernatural or paranormal in those mountains, some entity or phenomenon that caused them to flee in terror. Others, influenced by Gary's military background, have suggested government experiments or cover-ups, perhaps related to classified projects from his army days. Some have theorized about serial killers operating in the area despite the lack of any evidence of violence. Others have proposed scenarios involving organized crime, secret drug operations, or witness protection situations gone wrong. But the reality is almost certainly more mundane, if no less tragic. 5 vulnerable men, one of them experiencing a mental health crisis, made a series of terrible decisions or were overtaken by circumstances beyond their control and paid with their lives. What makes the Yuba County 5 case so compelling to those who study it, and so disturbing to those who contemplate it, is how it challenges our basic assumptions about human behavior and the survival instinct. We want to believe that when faced with life-threatening situations, people will do whatever it takes to survive. That a freezing person will seek warmth. That a starving person will eat available food. That lost people will stay in one place and signal for help, rather than wandering deeper into danger. The case of Ted Weiher, dying slowly in a supplied shelter, violates all of these assumptions. It shows us that the human mind, when damaged by cold, fear, illness, or trauma, can fail in ways that are almost incomprehensible to those of us in normal circumstances. A person can sit in the midst of salvation and be unable to reach for it because the bridge between need and action has collapsed. The abandoned Mercury Montego on that mountain road has become, in a way, a symbol of the case. That car, preserved now only in old police photographs and case files, represents the moment of divergence, the point where everything went wrong. Behind the car was safety, warmth, civilization, home, family, and the basketball game they were so excited about. Ahead of the car was only wilderness, darkness, cold, and death. They chose ahead, or were forced ahead, or were too confused to understand they had a choice at all. That car sitting alone on that snow-covered mountain road is the last place where we can say with certainty, this is where they were, this is what they did. Beyond that point, everything dissolves into speculation, theory, and heartbreaking mystery. If you visit Yuba County today, you'll find a community that has largely moved on, as communities do. The younger generations mostly don't know the story unless they're true crime enthusiasts who've discovered it online. But among older residents, particularly those in the disability community and those involved with the Special Olympics programs, the memory of the Gateway Gators remains. The basketball court where the team practiced is still there, though it's been resurfaced and updated many times since 1978. The echoes of their games, their laughter, their friendship have long since faded into the past. A small, modest memorial was erected years ago, though few people visit it now. The names Gary Mathias, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, and Ted Weiher. 5 friends who loved basketball and never got to play their big game. The case continues to fascinate true crime researchers, armchair detectives, and anyone who encounters the story. There are online forums dedicated to discussing theories. Podcasts have covered it. It's been featured in documentaries and true crime television shows. It's often called America's Dyatlov Pass, a reference to the famous 1959 incident in Russia where 9 experienced hikers died under mysterious circumstances in the Ural Mountains. Like Dyatlov Pass, the Yuba County 5 case presents us with physical evidence, with facts, with a timeline, but no explanation that adequately accounts for all of it. The harder you look at the details, the less sense it makes. And perhaps that's the most unsettling thing about this case. We live in a world where we expect mysteries to have solutions. We expect that if we gather enough evidence, interview enough witnesses, apply enough logic and investigative skill, we'll arrive at the truth. The Yuba County 5 case denies us that satisfaction. It remains stubbornly, maddeningly unsolvable. Not because we don't have information, we have plenty of information, but because the information we have doesn't assemble into a coherent picture. It's like trying to complete a jigsaw puzzle, where some of the pieces are from a different puzzle entirely, and some are missing, and some don't seem to fit any rational image. On February 24th, 1978, 5 friends walked out of their homes. They were excited about watching a basketball game and about their own game the next day. They were looking forward to coming home that night, maybe stopping for a late snack, maybe talking about the plays they'd seen, already anticipating their tournament the next morning. They had their whole lives ahead of them. Gary Mathias was working on managing his mental health. Jack Madruga loved his car. Bill Sterling was devoted to his family. Jack Hewitt was the youngest, full of energy and enthusiasm. Ted Wire was known for his gentle nature and kind heart. They went to watch a basketball game. They never came home. 4 of them died in the mountains under circumstances that make little sense. One of them was never found at all. And more than 45 years later, despite all our investigation, all our theories, all our analysis, we still don't really know why. We don't know what happened in that car on the drive that caused them to go so far off course. We don't know why they abandoned a working vehicle. We don't know why they walked 19 miles through the snow instead of seeking help. We don't know why Ted couldn't save himself when he had the means to do so. We don't know where Gary Mathias is. That's the story of the Yuba County Five. 5 men who walked into the snow and never came back. 5 families who lost their loved ones without explanation. 5 names on a memorial that ask more questions than they answer. And somewhere in those dark mountains, buried beneath decades of fallen leaves and new growth, the truth remains. As silent and cold as the snow that covered them so long ago. As we close this story tonight, it's worth remembering that behind every mystery, behind every unsolved case, there are real people, real families who waited by the phone for news that never came. Real parents who went to bed every night wondering what happened to their sons. Real friends who lost people they cared about. The Yuba County 5 case isn't just a puzzle to be solved or an interesting mystery to discuss. It's a tragedy that shattered multiple families and left wounds that never fully healed. Maybe someday someone will find that last piece of evidence that makes everything clear. Maybe a hiker will make a discovery. Maybe old records will reveal something new. Maybe, in some way we can't predict, the truth will finally emerge. But even if it doesn't, we can remember Gary, Jack, Bill, Jack, and Ted, not as a mystery, but as people. Friends who loved basketball, who cared about each other, who had hopes and dreams and people who loved them. So as you settle in for the night, remember that some mysteries remain just that, mysteries. And that's okay. We don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes, all we can do is remember those who were lost, honor their memory, and hope that wherever they are now, they've found peace at last. Sleep well, and thank you for listening to the story with me tonight. Take care of yourselves and each other.